So, the year 1890, there's a new technology that comes out in audiology. Does anyone have any idea what it would be? Big new technology, bars and coffee shops everywhere, excitement. Any idea? Guesses? No idea? Someone could say hearing aids at least, come on. It's not hearing aids. Tadoma, has anyone heard of Tadoma? Tadoma? Okay, Tadoma is where you try to understand what people are saying by touching their face. And the video you saw us messing around with a second ago, this is a video of someone doing Tadoma. Not quite from the 1890s. This is Helen Keller, who you may have heard of.
The throat, she feels the G, the hard G, the. And on the lips, she feels and the K sound. On the lips, she feels the V, and with the second finger on the nose, the nasal sound, The first word she learned to articulate was the little word it. With the hands in this position, I made the vowel I. She felt it. I. Then I made the T. She feels it with the finger on her lips, on my lips. Then I put the two letters together to form the word it, and the first word was learned. After her seventh lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word. I am not dumb now.
Okay, so that's cutting edge 1890. Fast forward now to around the 1920s in America, and you have rumors spreading about this girl called Willetta. Willetta is apparently a deaf and blind girl who claims to be able to read by feeling ink on a page. She claims to be able to smell colour, and this is a picture of her supposedly smelling the colour of Helen Keller's cardigan. That's who you just saw in the video, Helen Keller. She can identify people by their odour. You all know people are a bit like that, but she can identify all people by their odour. And importantly for us, she claims to be able to feel sound. And there's been a new technology development that's made this more exciting, and that's the telephone. So she can apparently feel what's being said by putting her fingers on the loudspeaker of the telephone, like this. So that's what she claims, and she's showing people herself doing this. And what happens is this guy, Robert Galt, gets hold of the story. He's an audiologist and a researcher in America at the time. And what he does is he grabs his friend and he drives out to a house to go and test drive. I think you would take your friend if you were going to visit someone who claims to smell colour. Anyway, he turns up with his friend, and what he does is a little experiment that he knocks together. So he goes into a cupboard. This is a sketch from the time of doing it. Goes into this cupboard and he puts a great sheet over his head, and he's talking into the microphone of the telephone. He then runs a cable outside of the cupboard, and Willetta is sat outside with her fingers on the loudspeaker with corks in her ears and giant blankets over her head so she can't hear. And she's got to repeat back what he's saying from inside the cupboard by just feeling the vibrations on her fingers. And by his reports, he writes a paper on this, and he says he's completely convinced. He says, I believe we have here a satisfactory demonstration that she interprets the human voice through vibrations against her fingers. So he is sold. So sold, in fact, that he rushes off to Bell Labs. Bell Labs, Alexander Graham Bell is the supposed inventor of the telephone, and Bell Labs is this huge technology company in his name. It's equivalent to something like a Google would be today. Huge technology company. Goes to them and he says, can we build some sort of tactile aid for the deaf? And it's the first time that they would have been able to say yes in history. And that's because there's also been a revolution at this time in amplification technology. It's got to the point now where they can amplify sound enough to turn it into something that you could feel on your skin. So that's largely why this happens now. This is the device they build. Well, this is part of the device they build. This is the part that sits on the table. Those contact points you can see here, you put your finger on, and that's where you feel the sound coming through as vibration. Out of shot, this wire goes off to a huge rack of amplifiers and all sorts. It's by no means some portable thing that you could just carry around, but Robert Galt does take it out to schools for the deaf and get some really quite interesting results with it. By the early 1930s, it's getting picked up by the New York Times. I've clipped the New York Times headline about it. We're getting pretty excited. And it's all starting to take off. What became of Willetta? Well, so there was this guy around, the scientist called Jastrow, and he didn't believe any of it. He thought it was all just scientists getting overexcited about a load of nonsense. He talked about their will to believe. He went and tested out this smelling colour thing, and she couldn't do it, so he wasn't convinced at all. And he said, a quote up there, what he said, "The awkward question cannot be avoided as to whether intentional deception encroaches upon self-deception on the part of the performer." So he is not convinced at all. He thinks she is a bit of a fraud, and he's largely vindicated because Robert Galt visited her around 1922. 2 years later, she was suddenly declared cured of all her ailments. She was practically normal in both senses. She put it down to her faith in God and the advice she'd been getting from those trusty Christian science practitioners she'd been hanging out with. She then disappeared, changed her name, wasn't found until decades later. When they found her, she was a sort of mystical healer type and wouldn't talk about the past. So it seems she probably wasn't for real, but she was a useful fraud all the same. Okay, so on from Willetta, World War. After the war, there's a loss of interest in this area, and that's largely because there's a widely held belief around audiology that there actually aren't many people with what would at the time have been called total deafness. And the reason they think that is that when they do audiometry, they find that pretty much everyone, even with a profound hearing loss, can detect low-pitched sounds. They can measure thresholds for them. And we talked about the amplification revolution, so they think, okay, well, we know where this is going to go. We'll just get better amplifiers. We'll just turn the sound up more, and they'll be able to hear it. We don't need these tactile devices so much. Any idea what's going on there? We've got a pretty good idea that people really do have profound hearing loss. We fit cochlear implants in them. So we suspect this is wrong. Any idea why? What mistake they're making? How they're able to detect the sounds? Yeah.
Vibration?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's all it is. It turns out that actually they were just feeling it through their skin. It's too intense. That gets basically, that error gets rumbled by the late 1960s. It's pretty clearly demonstrated that that's what's going on, and that there really are people with what was called total deafness. There's then a big growth of interest again. And this growth of interest now is powered by new technology as well. We're not in the Robert Galt era. We're in an era now where you can have wearable technology, especially as we start to go into the 1980s. But, and also, so this is an example of one of the early devices. This was a NASA device. It was worn around the abdomen. But at the same time, we've got a new technology in town as well, and that's the cochlear implant. And what happens is they basically face up against each other. It's what's going to be the most effective treatment for people with severe or profound hearing impairment. Is it going to be the tactile aid, or is it going to be the cochlear implant? And into the 1980s, the tactile aid is doing pretty well. This is a study from the mid-1980s of a device worn on the arm. What you're seeing here is the number of hours they've used the device on the bottom. And this is the vocabulary, effectively, of words that they've been able to learn just with tactile stimulation. And what you can see is that after 82 hours of using the device, the user in this study was able to get a vocabulary of about 250 words. Not bad. But at the same time, the cochlear implant is really taking off. So this is showing you speech recognition in quiet, percentage of words that they can recognize in quiet. You see, in 1980, it's pretty rubbish. It's not doing very well. But even just a decade later, it's come on a huge distance. We've got from basically nothing to 60% of words correctly identified in quiet. And then we have another huge leap in the next decade, so that by the early 2000s, we get to basically where we are now for speech in quiet, over 80% of words correctly identified. And what happens is the tactile aid just gets wiped out. Nobody's interested in this anymore. Companies that were doing tactile aids collapsed. Nobody's interested. If you try to apply for research funding, you get laughed out of the room. Great big cochlear implant centres are built in honour of the success of the cochlear implant, and nobody's doing tactile aids anymore. But there are, of course, some limitations with cochlear implants that I'm sure you're somewhat aware of. So what's some of the key limitations with cochlear implant listening?
Think of how Sam did the other day when she came to see you. What are the problems with cochlear implants? I heard some murmuring here behind me.
I think multiple sclerosis.
I'm sorry then?
Multiple sclerosis.
Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, there's some limitations in who can get the implant. Thinking about performance, so you've got your implant, and where would you struggle?
Noisy environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So speech and noise is a big problem, and another one is sound localization, so your spatial hearing. So they're two of the big ones. There are more, but they're two big ones. So understanding speech when there's a lot of background noise, locating sounds, separating out sounds coming from different locations are big problems for cochlear implant users. It's not really surprising that this is the case if you think of what the cochlear implant's trying to do. It's trying to provide the sound information that in a healthy cochlea will be transferred by around 3,500 hair cells. It's now trying to transmit that same information to the brain, but it's got at most just 22 electrodes to do it with. So it's actually amazing it does as well as it does do, and not surprising really that when things get a bit complicated, there's background noise, that it starts to, the performance starts to break down. What I've been arguing for, and will argue for today, is that rather than looking at it like this, as two things in conflict, maybe we could look at this as potentially a supplementary technology, tactile stimulation. Maybe we can provide some of the sound information that the cochlear implant isn't providing very well. Maybe we can provide that through vibration, haptic stimulation, and what we're looking at is doing that on the wrists. So that's the term I've been using for that is electro-haptic stimulation, so the electrical signal from the implant combined with the haptic signal, the vibration signal on the wrist. You may have heard the term or be familiar with the term electroacoustic stimulation. Same idea, just replaced acoustic with haptic basically. So yeah, similar basic idea, but we're now trying to provide that missing information through haptics instead. So, two very obvious questions. Does it work for speech and noise, and does it work for spatial hearing? Can we improve either of those doing this? So firstly, speech and noise. So this, I'm going to tell you the results of two studies we did a couple of years ago. This is MSc studies here. One with Amma and one with Vincent. When we're doing, when I'm doing this research, my sort of philosophy in doing it is that we should always, although we're in the lab, we should always be sort of restraining ourselves by what could be done in the real world. So we don't use fancy algorithms that you need 50 supercomputers to run, or that need to see the future, or anything like that. We limit ourselves a lot in what we're doing. So examples of that here in the bullet points. So we're delivering our haptic stimulation to the wrists, like because we think a wristband would be a viable way to deliver it in the real world. Our algorithm to convert sound to vibration, as I say, is not some big computationally heavy thing. It's something that you could do on a small device. You wouldn't need huge power requirements or something like that. And then when we're testing, we try to use realistic test sounds as best as we can. So sentences, actual speech, and realistic background noises, fluctuating noises with multiple talkers, that kind of thing. So that's how we try to constrain ourselves when we're working on this, with the idea that hopefully that means if we find some good stuff that's going to be translatable, it's actually going to lead to some benefits. So the first studies we did, this is what we found. So we found that we were able to improve recognition in cochlear implant users 10% more words they could get when they had the haptic stimulation than when they didn't. And some of the users were getting 20% more words when they had the haptic stimulation than when they didn't. And this is only after 20 minutes of training. So this wasn't after some huge 82-hour training regime. So this might just be the start of what can be achieved. So 10%, is that good? Does that sound good? Quote from the Donald, I have removed 10% of the words. So, he says, we're rounding them up in a very way, and they're going to be happy. They want to be. And by the way, I know it doesn't sound nice. So it's really hard to know what on earth he's going on about there, right? It's still quite hard to know what he's going on about, but you can see key information was missing there. Now, the cynical amongst you may think that I've just removed the only 10% that would do that. Here's a completely different 10% removed. Still really hard to get the meaning. Were up in a very humane way, in a very nice, and they're going to be because they want to be legalized. And by the way, it doesn't sound nice. So it's another 10% gone, really hard to get. I won't read it again, but here's another completely different 10%. And again, we lose the meaning. So I think hopefully this demonstrates to you that 10% is a lot when it comes to understanding what people are saying. Okay, so with the caveat that this testing is in the lab, I think we can say that at least in principle, it seems that yes, this does work for improving speech and noise performance. So, locating sounds. So, does anyone have any ideas how we could get spatial hearing information to the brain through vibration? Any ideas? If I was to say you've got 2 ears and 2 wrists.
So you'd have to compare the difference in intensity and time of the vibrations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so apologies for the sort of patronising style of this. This was from an article that I did for children, but hopefully gets the idea across. It's exactly as you say. We're taking advantage of the cues that the normal auditory system uses. And all we do is we just take the sound from behind each ear and convert it down to vibration on each wrist. That means that if the sound's over to the left, because it will be louder in the left ear than the right ear, it'll be stronger on the left wrist than the right wrist. So it's a really simple map. Over to the right, stronger on the right wrist. In the middle, equally strong. Very simple. Don't have to go through some giant training regime or explanation to get that. It's very intuitive. So again, MSc students working on this. We set up a semicircle of loudspeakers that I'm showing there in the anechoic chamber behind RTR, and got some cochlear implant users in, and what they had to do is they had to tell us which loudspeaker sound came from, either just using their cochlear implant or using that in combination with haptic stimulation linking them. And what we found was that they improved dramatically even without any training. We barely had to instruct them, it's intuitive enough. This shows you basically the error, how far they were from the correct loudspeaker on average. With just the audio, with just their cochlear implants, the error was huge, as you'd expect, for cochlear implant users. And it was one of those things where I had to check a bunch of times afterwards because the effects were so big, it looked ridiculous. You didn't really need statistics or anything, the effects were so large. Crushed down dramatically, got to the levels that you'd expect from a hearing aid user. So we're getting cochlear implant users to the levels you'd expect from a hearing aid user, and that's without training. So we could probably get them even better than that. So that was very promising. And again, with that important caveat, we're doing this in a lab setting, anechoic chamber. It does seem that, again, at least in principle, yes, this probably can work for spatial hearing. Okay, so why is this working so well? Better than I was expecting, certainly. Especially how quickly people get on board with this and start using the cues. I think it's fundamentally because the way the brain works is that it just loves collecting information. It's trying to build this map, this model of the world, and it doesn't really get hung up and fussy about where the information comes from. If there's good information coming in, it's going to use it. It's very flexible. It doesn't mind if things are weird. So the famous study from the late 1990s in the neurosciences in animals, where they demonstrated this on a sort of neurophysiological level. What they did is they rerouted the visual input coming into the brain from the eyes to the auditory cortex, to the auditory part of the brain. And then they found that the animals, once they'd so they did this when they were infants, and then when they grew up, they were actually able to see, even though the information is now going to an auditory part of their brain. It wasn't that the brain got all fussy and said, what's that all about? It just took it on, and it starts using it and processes information. Okay. To some extent, it's all just neural spikes as far as the brain are concerned. It doesn't really care where it came from. It will use that information it will put together. More everyday example, I think. If you think of something like just playing the piano, you think of the idea of pitch. So pitch, we say high-pitched and low-pitched, but we don't really mean high up there and low down there, but it's kind of like that, but as a concept. And then you get this piano, and now it's press the buttons over to the left, and it's low-pitched, press the buttons over to the right, it's high-pitched. That's quite weird, but it doesn't seem that weird. Pretty much everyone can just pick that up pretty easily. You don't sort of rebel against that and go, hang on, no, pitch for me is up. You don't do that. Then think of an organ or something. Now it's getting really ridiculous. You've got the feet, that's kind of really low, and then the next level up, that's sort of low and left, but low and left, but that's low. Yeah, but people learn it. You can learn this stuff really quite easily. Final example. So this is when I was doing my MSc project, aged 2010, a long time ago, at Nottingham. I was just a participant. And we did this really weird experiment I took part in because I was part of the psychology department. You had the screen, and what you did is you put your hand under the screen, and you could see what looks like your hand just moving around. And what they did was they, a bit theatrical, they went, right, we're going to make your finger longer. And they sort of rub your finger, and it looks like it's got loads longer. And it's so weird because you just immediately accept that my finger's now 3 times the length, and you start moving your finger around like it's 3 times the length. You don't go, hang on, my finger didn't just grow 3 times the length. You just accept it instantly. And then as part of the sort of theatrics, they go, oh, don't worry, put it back, and they rub it and they make it short. And then it feels like it's tiny and it's moving about and it's all tiny. But you don't, there's no time, there's no sort of like few seconds of you going, hang on, this isn't right. You completely accept it. There's all sorts of stuff they're doing. They then basically make it look like your hand's shifted, and then make your hand disappear, and then you go, where's my hand? But anyway, yeah. But yeah, they do. It's amazing how quickly you just accept, oh, the world is completely different in bizarre ways that it couldn't be. And I think that's the core point. That's why you're picking up things like speech through vibration. The brain just isn't fussy with these things. If that's how the information comes in, it will take it. Okay, so what are we doing with this? Well, the big push we've been having, as I sort of implied earlier, is to try and get this to a device that we can actually get out into the world. And the timing for doing this is incredibly good. Since this was last seriously looked at in the sort of mid-1990s, every single key technology has moved on a huge distance. So you're probably not aware of how far haptic actuator technology has moved on, but particularly in the last few years, that's shifted hugely forward. And that's largely driven by things like the computer gaming industry, and driven by, oddly and somewhat to my surprise, cars. The screens, the haptic feedback on the screens. It's bad to have loads of buttons in your car design, apparently, so you sort of have virtual vibrating buttons on the screen. And there's a lot of money that's gone into that. And that's led to the development of low-powered, small haptic actuators that are just a million miles from anything you could have dreamed of in the 90s. So that technology's moved on a huge distance. Everyone's aware, computer chip, microprocessor technology. You think of what a phone could do in the 90s and what your smartphone can do now. Same with algorithms and data availability. So things algorithms can do, the amount of data available to train those algorithms and optimize those algorithms, that's moved on a huge distance. Wireless technology, some of you may be aware of a bit because this has been implemented in hearing aids and cochlear implants more recently, but things like Bluetooth Low Energy, you might have heard of Bluetooth LE. There's a lot of features of that. It's not just the fact it's low energy, there's a lot of features that have huge improvements on classic Bluetooth. those sort of technologies moving forward could be really important for what we're doing. I was talking about streaming audio down from behind the ears, for example, for their spatial hearing. Streaming audio from remote microphones, streaming audio from your doorbell, that kind of thing. So that technology moves on like massively. Battery technology, again, think of smartphones, and then manufacturing technology for an operation of our small size, absolutely key. It's probably only the last 2 years or so that we could have done the flexible 3D printing that we're doing at our level as a research group. And because we can 3D print like that, we can go through different designs quite quickly. It would have taken years to go through the number of designs that we've been able to go through, even in the last couple of months, trying out different things. So that technology, and that's another one where it's moving very fast. We're at the start of this. So great timing in that way. This is where we got to, and I will try and arrange a demo session at some point so you can feel it, but that's basically what the device looks like at the moment. It's not the most beautiful thing in the world, but we're prototyping and we're academics. So yeah, that's basically the kind of thing it looks like. Should have bought one to wave them around. But anyway, that's basically where we're heading. And then finally, I just wanted to say this. So this is the cochlear implants module. We've been talking about cochlear implants, but this isn't just for cochlear implant users. Possibly aware, well, you're probably aware, cochlear implants are very expensive and prohibitively so for a lot of low to middle income countries. Not only do you need some serious cash, you need some serious infrastructure as well in terms of your healthcare infrastructure to do this. For the surgery, for the aftercare. So cochlear implants just aren't available for a lot of people with a profound hearing loss. I'm sure you'll be very aware that young children with unmanaged hearing loss, it's well known, will typically have big deficits in terms of their language development, their cognitive development, their educational attainment. And I just clipped this bit in italics here from this review, where they estimate that in India, so that's a country of well over 1 billion people, in India, less than 1/3 of children who have a hearing loss are enrolled in school at any level. And less than 2% receive secondary higher education or above. So a big, big unmet need there. And it's not just children, adults with a hearing loss tend to have a much lower employment rate, and they also tend to, when they do work in much lower grade, crappier jobs. So a big unmet need there, and maybe that's something where we could at least contribute. If we have a haptic hearing aid of the sort that I just showed you an image of, we're dealing with something that's very low cost. The motors would be less than £5 each, the haptic shakers. All the components are cheap, basically. We don't have to implant it. We don't actually have to do any fitting, really. It might be ideal to do some fitting, but you don't have to do fitting. You could just give them as much welly as we can. It's not like I'm going to shake their wrists off with the sort of stuff we're doing. So we could potentially have something that doesn't need to be fitted by any clinician, that is non-invasive and is low cost, and they can basically just put it on and learn. We don't know how far we could go with that. We might at least be able to contribute to the people who are basically getting nothing at the moment. Okay, and that's it. That's my case for haptic hearing aids. A lot of people to thank beyond this, but Nikki mentioned she was involved. That was with Ahmed up towards the top left. Sam Perry at the top left does a lot of work on this, on the technology side particularly. Esma's been doing a load of work for us recently with algorithm development, trying to improve our algorithm. Carl has supported us from the point at which we had absolutely 0 pence and just an idea, and a few others on there as well. And no, I won't stop babbling, because I will just say the 2 places to go to read stuff if you're interested. So this one was written for teenagers, but it at least gives you the idea without hopefully being too much hard work. This one here, and then this is written for like advanced audiologist researchers. So some of it might be a bit tricky, but it's a review paper. I'm trying to give an overview of, at least in 2021, where things were with this and why I think it's exciting. We have a lab page that you can visit and we keep up to date with what we're up to, and you can email me or ask questions now.